did hear that.
All right. Again, we'll just follow the pattern of the debate for the moment, and we'll probably divert a few times to the other issues, jump forward and backwards a couple of times because that's just the way things happen. All right. Keenan, I think you start off adequately explaining what the topic is and giving us a goal that we ought to be reaching for. I think there's a philosophical concept here that would be a good premise for a significance claim, and then you ought to explain why it is that we're failing to meet that significance claim. So the president says that we need a world-class education for everyone. Well, where's the proof that we're not getting a world-class education for everyone? That's the thing that I think is missing here. The argument is that we can't pay for it, but there's no real criticism of the education that people are getting. I think there might be some problems there, but that's not really where you're headed. Your argument is that everybody needs to have access to this and that people aren't getting access to that. So, where's the information about who's denied access? That comes up as an issue later on in the debate, that people who are poor are maybe denied access, but it never becomes the main issue that you are arguing for. Your significance claim is primarily about debt issues, and you've got some good information that talks about how currently the way we finance things, it results in a substantial amount of debt because the costs at private colleges and the costs at public colleges and universities has gone up substantially, and that we have millions of Americans who leave college with a huge amount of debt. You mentioned that we've got 40 million Americans with a lot of debt, and you even quantify the total amount of debt as at $1.2 trillion, and then you've got this little countdown about how much it's going up every second. So debt is the issue that you get into. And, there's a lot of energy and time spent on that. Now, here's the question that I have. What's the harm of that debt? I think that you don't quite get to that harm in the constructive speech. There is a discussion of the harm in the second affirmative where we hear that debt means that people can't start businesses, that they can't get going in their careers, that they are hindered in some way, and that there's a problem. But I think you ought to have some hint of that at the beginning so that we know that the real argument here is about that very first thing. The economic engine requires people who are well educated and able to take that education and utilize it. We might have a lot of people who are well educated, but they're hindered in utilizing it. Plus, we have some people who aren't being educated because they can't afford access to it. That's basically, the two significance claims that you're presenting. You don't do much with the first one, getting everybody access who needs it, and everything that you put into it in the constructive is about that particular debt issue. And like I said, I think the debt issue is a good one. It's nicely developed. Now, you're anticipating, it's kind of an inherency argument. Why do we have this debt issue? There's some criticism of financial aid, and you have a statistic or a piece of information that says, the average financial aid is $3,000. Most of this information, by the way, is never cited. You don't give us sources for any of this information. And that one's an important one because if the negative comes up and says, look, we got plenty of financial aid. Here's how much we gave out in financial aid last year. Here's what people are getting. We have lots of people who get forgiveness. We get lots of, like they both use examples going to school here and not having to pay tuition because of the BOG. That seems to me like that's a good answer. And your argument here is a response to it. If we get $3,000 per student in assistance, but the cost is going to a public college university is $18,000, then in essence we have to make up that difference with the $15,000 in debt that's going on. And that's just the math that you want to do. You could grant them and say, there is aid that is available, but it's not sufficient to cover the costs that the students pay, and that's why we end up with the debt, because we've shifted at some point away from providing this kind of assistance. And then, like I said, right at the very end, you mentioned the tuition keeping low-income students out, and that's the second significance claim that's going on there, and that needs to be developed a little bit more. Like I said before, there's not really a lot of sources that are being cited in the presentation. So the debt issue is nicely developed. Again, I think you've got good statistical information. We ought to get sources for that. I think you need a bigger argument on the access issue that develops that particular point a little bit more. And then a little bit stronger criticism of how the financial aid system that we have is inadequate. You're kind of relying on the debt thing to explain all of that. In addition to being a significance claim, it's also kind of an inherency argument by default. And I think that that's probably not clear enough. So you need to develop a little bit more on that. All right. Monica, I thought that you start off with a reasonable question. Why are we going to give this to everybody? We have a lot of people who haven't earned this idea. And I think that that's a good point. I think you should develop that. It's not that hard to point to and say, look, we have lots of students who get out of high school who are underprepared. We know that from going to school here. Look at how many classes we have at the college that are primarily remedial classes in nature. There's one department that we have here is basically in our division is basically a remedial department. Why do people need to take reading classes in college? It seems kind of strange. Plus, we have, I don't know what the number is, I haven't looked, but if you would look, you'd probably see that a large percentage of the English classes are not even for credit classes. They are 60, or below level classes, and you're not getting transfer credit for that. And that's all getting people prepared who weren't prepared in the beginning. And the idea that these people ought to be getting free tuition is problematic. Anything beyond what they're getting now. I think you've got a good argument that says, look, we have plenty of access for people, and here's my experience. I don't have the income to be able to do this. I get to go to school here. I got a grant that helps pay for some things. I don't have to pay tuition. And you know what? I need the assistance because I'm not in the same place as somebody else. I should, and I think there's nothing wrong with saying, I shouldn't be going to a state university yet until I'm well prepared for doing that. And that's what they're saying is, we're not going to pick and choose anymore. Everybody gets access to anything that they want, and there's something unreasonable about that. I think that should be the position that the negative takes. It says the system that we have does a lot of filtering, and there's a reason that we do that filtering, and it's not because we don't want people to succeed. It's that we recognize that some people are either underprepared to succeed or not motivated to succeed. And how do we know that? Well, here at the community college, and somebody had that statistic somewhere, I forget when it came up, I think maybe in the second negative, we got like 40% of the students who start here never finish. That's a big chunk of students. Now, if that big chunk of students was getting the equivalent of $18,000 a year, and they spent 2 years doing that, and then they don't finish, that seems like a huge investment for taxpayers to make for nothing. And in essence, that everybody should be, when they come back to this argument, I mean, they sneak it in at the end. This is, well, look, we all pay for high schools and elementary schools and that sort of thing. I think what you do is you turn around and say, and we're all paying for colleges too. We already do that kind of stuff. This is not a charity case that exists here. The people of California pay for colleges and they pay for universities and they provide a lot of assistance. They just don't pay for all of it. So the idea that you have to pay for all of it in order to be granting an opportunity, I think that's kind of what the negative position ought to be. We shouldn't have to pay for everything. Students need to be responsible for some of this also. And you kind of make that argument. And then that's the last time anybody ever talks about it. I mean, I won't say the last time that anybody talks about it, but that's a good negative philosophy, and I think it needs to be developed a little bit more. You've got a nice statistic here, or a nice piece of testimony that would make for a good lead into a disadvantage argument, and I'm not sure why the disadvantage argument doesn't get made later on, or why you don't make it yourself. Hillary Clinton says it's going to cost us $350 billion a year. I'm sorry, $350 billion a year? there are lots of ways to make comparisons. What equivalent things are we spending $350 billion a year on? Oh, I don't know. Everything that, not football, the welfare system, that's probably about $350 billion. The healthcare system, that's easily, $350 billion is a big chunk of that. The idea that we can drop $350 billion and not feel it someplace else is problematic. And I think there's a disadvantage to be made that says we would have to make some choices here. We're either going to have to increase taxes substantially, and there's a negative consequence to doing that, and we get a disadvantage based on that, or we're going to have to cut other things that we're spending money on and argue that, there are harmful consequences from doing that. And that's the trigger argument for the disadvantage, and then nobody does anything with that. It just kind of sits there. So you've got that argument out there, and you need to do something with it. I think you've got a good solvency argument that you're presenting here that says you can't get out of debt by having tuition be free because you still have all these other things that you have to pay for and take care of, and that those are the things that end up costing students a lot of money. Places that already have free tuition, we've got examples of where that's the case. And you point to the example, I guess it's in Sweden, where students are graduating with an average of $19,000 in debt. So here we graduate with $28,000 in debt. In Sweden, where education is free, they're not dropping they're already dropping $350 billion on it, and they're still graduating with $19,000 in debt. So in essence, what their argument is, you just put these two things together. We're going to drop $350 billion for free tuition to reduce the $10,000 that we pay more than the Swedes pay for their education. That seems like a big commitment to make in terms of money. I don't want to sound like Ebenezer Scrooge, but could somebody please make an argument about how minimal the debt is? This should be a first negative argument. You make a little bit of an argument about this, but you say, you kind of have an argument about this where you argue later on, when people graduate, they earn more, there's a value to that, and they should be able to pay their debt back. I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to sound like Scrooge on this. $28,000 in debt, that's a car. People buy cars all the time. That's not the thing that is crippling the world, that somebody has $28,000 in debt. If that were the case, nobody would be buying automobiles. This notion that they are selling us that, students get out with $28,000 in debt, I'm going, that's like if they graduated and bought a car. That's $400 a month for 5 to 10 years. That's, it's not cheap. But it's not like, oh my gosh, I can't start a business because I own, my car payment this month. That's what they're saying. Oh, I can't do anything. I can't accomplish anything because I've got that amount of debt. To me, this is something that you guys ought to be responding to and arguing about. I'm not saying debt's a great thing, but you get something for the debt. You make that argument in the second negative, and you need to diminish this argument a little bit. They get a pass on the debt issue. It's like you in the first negative, you're not really saying anything about the debt issue, and I think that gives them so much more opportunity to exploit it than they would be able to have otherwise. I think you need to go after it a little bit more forcefully. I did think, though, when you got to their second significance argument about how tuition keeps people out, that's where you had a very good argument, and you used that personal example. We've got lots of assistance programs. People can do this. The idea that poor people can't get access to college is almost a myth because of the way it works here in California especially. And you're an example of that. I think that that's a good idea. So that addresses that issue right away. I don't know exactly what the cost of living argument is that comes up. It comes up and there's not really much explanation about why it's important. So unless it works into an argument later on, I think it's a little bit of wasted effort there. Yeah. All right, and both sides talk about that, and I'm going, okay, well, where does that go? All right. On the second affirmative, Roland, you got a lot of answers there, but they're not very well organized. It's just like I'm going to stand up and I'm just going to start making arguments and claims and reading evidence, and it's not particularly being applied to arguments that your partner made. So you're not really following his case structure. It's not being applied to arguments that Monica made, so you're not really following her arguments. I'm having to kind of guess where things apply. And sometimes I figure that out, but you should be telling me. And you should go back to the case and say, look, Keenan said that the costs are, at least $18,000 for a public university. And he told you that there's only $3,000 in assistance that's available, which means the vast majority of it has to be assumed as debt. And here's what the debt is, and here are all the things that my partner said about debt. And what did the negatives say about it? They didn't say anything about it. So we've got all of the original arguments that are still here. Now, you do extend the debt argument. So, I did recognize that there were good arguments. Yeah, you're saying things about it, and you're making some additional points about it. But I don't think you get as much from what he said to begin with to add, to it. You're kind of making a second argument about those issues as opposed to just, filling in some blank spaces. And you also want to do the contrast thing. Is there any argument that says that the debt is not important from the negative? No, they don't say anything about that. Is there, the only thing that they talk about, by the way, is this cost issue, which you never talk about. $350 billion. And it's like, you make no argument. Well, I think there are answers to that. The first answer is this is just an investment cost. It's like anything. You're spending money to, create a foundation. Yes, you have to spend money in order to develop the economy. But we're saying, in essence, we got $1.2 trillion in debt. If we spend $350 billion a year, you know what? We won't have $1.2 trillion in debt. That kind of stuff goes away, and that's the thing that drives the economy. So, don't be shy about making an argument about this and say, this is like anything. You're investing your money in this and your time in it because it's going to pay off in the long run, and that's going to be a benefit for us. And I don't, by the way, I don't know where Hillary Clinton comes up with the number of $350 billion. She just does, so you could even press that a little bit. What is it? Bernie Sanders' plan wants to spend, $70 billion? Isn't that the estimate that you guys had?
700. It was actually 700. If the fund would have been, like right now,
I don't know, everywhere I've heard 70 billion.
Yeah, well, okay, this is one of the problems when you're not this is one of the problems when you are not citing evidence completely as a quote, you're not giving a source citation on it, then who knows what is true. It's awfully hard to track that. Now, they come back and they say it's $700 billion. How do I know? How do I know that they're citing the same source as you and that you misread it? Or that you got it accurate and they are misunderstanding what you're saying? I have no way of comparing that because there's not a source citation with this information. That's one of the problems I won't say I've seen it consistently, but I did see it in this debate. Some of the other debates have done a pretty good job citing their sources. This one was a little bit less so. Although I thought you did a good job in your constructive. I heard, from Whitmer, and I heard from, that other guy, Samuels. So we got source citations there. You also make an argument that I think is an interesting one that also goes nowhere because you don't do anything with it, which says, if we did this, if the schools were in better shape and they had the money like this, that they wouldn't, they'd be able to have tenured professors and all that stuff, and that's going to be so much better. Okay, that's an interesting argument. The quality of education is going to improve. First, I'm not sure that that's true because why is how the students pay for school going to change, the way the schools are financed currently? That seems to me like there's a big assumption in there somehow that you're making that hasn't been explained. But let's suppose for a moment that part is true, and now you've got an additional significance claim. That's the last time we ever hear about it. So it gets presented as, there'll be this big bonus that will have tenured faculty. You don't tell us why tenured faculty is automatically better. How does it help the students? What does it do that drives the productivity of the economy of the schools or any of that sort of thing? I think there's good arguments to be made that says tenured faculty do improve the students. You got contact hours that are so much better. Maybe there's a little bit of an issue. This is one of the things that my colleagues and I sometimes talk about because we run into this issue. Why is it that why do we have an achievement gap with students, and everybody's talking about that? How could we best address that? And we think having more tenured faculty is a good idea because that makes it easier for students to come get help, to be mentored by folks. When you have a part-time student who's teaching the class, or part-time faculty, I should say, teaching the class, I think our part-time faculty do a good job and they work hard, but let's face it, they're not here all the time. You can't ask them for assistance. I've seen a half dozen of you come into my office and come and say, what should I be doing here? What more can I do? How could I change this? I need some help, Beck. And that's all stuff that you can't get with adjunct faculty, that you only get with tenured faculty. And hopefully it makes a difference. I don't know how much of a difference it makes. Like I said, I'm sure that there are some adjunct faculty members that you guys identify with more because they are, they're not decrepit old guys, sitting in their office, and you go, I can at least talk to that person, yeah, in their suspenders. Stockbroker or farmer?
Pharmacist.
Pharmacist. He's splitting the difference. I think they need to be thicker to be farmer. I think this, the herringbone kind of style there, it seems to me more like it's stockbroker. Well, I'm just asking is my perception accurate?
I would say it's more farmer.
More farmer?
But I get your point on the thickness.
Yeah.
Like, I get your point.
Yeah.
She's trying to get ahead.
Oh, she's sucking up, yeah. Did she say lawyer? Is that what it was? Lawyer, doctor? Yeah, I did do that. Yeah. Okay. But the idea is that there might be an argument there, but you never go anywhere with it. So having raised it, I'm not sure what the value is. All right, now I got to jump over here because we got Diana still to talk about. 80% of what Diana said should have been the first negative constructive because it's really about whether or not this is a problem, minimizing those issues, arguing some inherency arguments. There's a lot of stuff there that is really about these things. The second negative traditionally is where you put in the disadvantages. This is where that argument about the $350 billion should be and why that's going to be a crippling cost. You've made a solvency argument. You could also extend, well, actually you do. You make the argument that says that people don't succeed and they still end up in debt. So we get that again. So there's a little bit of repetition there. That's a workability argument. So that kind of belongs there. But you've got an argument that says that they've got these options. Here's the Obama Forgiveness Act, and we got free tuition. We're going, well, that's all stuff that should have, that's significant stuff, inherency stuff that should have been in the first negative constructive. You kind of talk about the response to this argument about, we started off originally, they were land-grant colleges and tuition was free, and you're saying there's a big difference now because we got a huge amount of debt, and so on and so forth. That, by the way, potentially feeds their argument saying, yeah, a huge amount of debt. I wonder if that's a problem for anybody. You're saying it's a problem for the country, it's such a problem that we can't afford to take care of our students very well. And they're going to come back and say, gee, maybe there's an analogy to be drawn here that there's a problem with having too much debt. Because that's your argument as to why we don't have these tuition-free things. What are the future students going to have to give up because they're in so much debt? So you want to be a little bit careful about that argument. And I don't even know that it gets you that much because they're not really using that as a point to advance their claim. They just kind of make maybe kind of a fairness argument about it. Like I said, I think there's an argument to be made that says we're going to invest a lot of this money and it's not going to get spent well. And then there's an argument that says, well, why is that a bad thing? Because we could be spending this money on a lot of other things that would be more productive in the way it's used. And I think that that's the disadvantage that's missing. You kind of respond to the crime issue, which was an additional significance claim that they presented in the second affirmative. I'm sure that Monica would get to it when she goes to the first negative rebuttal, except that you've already made the arguments, and so she doesn't need, so she's kind of run out of things to talk about at one point because You've made the argument on that issue. There's no point in repeating an argument that hasn't even been answered by them yet. So there's kind of a hole there that's being created. All right, so that's the constructive speeches. We get to the rebuttals, you kind of need to start focusing a little bit. And I think this is where, sometimes you're doing the right thing and sometimes you're off on a little bit of a tangent. It comes down to you need more disadvantage arguments, reasons why this is a bad idea, and you need to emphasize the debt issue a little bit more and say this is the whole purpose here is to focus on reducing student debt and why that's important. And you ought to be taking advantage of those the fact that they didn't have extensive arguments on those particular points. And like I said, I think you need a stronger harm to spending all of this money this way. And like I said, I think if you had that philosophical argument developed at the beginning, that would also be helpful, that you could always come back to that and say, if you think giving people free access to something is a good way of them learning responsibility, taking care of themselves, and making things better, you're living in fantasy world. That's just not the way the world works. Just because somebody gets something free doesn't mean that they benefit from that freedom. And there are lots of things all kinds of examples you can point to. People get free opportunities and they don't do anything with them. Their assumption is that the world's going to be a better place if we do this, and you have to challenge that assumption a little bit. The closest you come to challenging that assumption is the argument that says that we got a bunch of people who aren't going, they don't complete their education, and when they do complete their education, they still end up in debt. So if they still end up in debt, you're not going to get the economic advantage that they talk about. That's the thing that they keep harping on. You got to go after that. All right. I don't know what the Donald Trump reference is at the end. He's a rich guy. What the hell? Yeah. It's to say something.
Yeah. I needed the 4 minutes, man.
Yeah, I think there's a stretch there. The argument from Ellison at the end is kind of a good one. If we'd had more argument from the negative about why are we doing this, then I think there's a good argument there. They don't really get into that much. I think they might have and made a better, stronger argument in response. But it's an okay answer on that particular point. I think the better argument that you have toward the end is, look, college fees have gone up immensely. It's, like you said, 17 times more costly to go to some colleges and universities now than it was back in 1971. And we've been cutting the assistance that we provide people instead of expanding the assistance. Just as a side note, nobody made this argument, and it's just one of those things that I think if you'd done some research on this, you'd have discovered this. One of the arguments that suggests that the reason the college costs have accelerated so much is because of easy debt. All right, so in other words, it used to be college costs filtered in who got into school because people couldn't afford to pay for it. But once we made it easy for people to pay for college by taking on debt, for instance, suddenly that's not filtering people in anymore. So what do the colleges do? They increase their fees. So in essence, the debt pushes the fee cost higher, which then, of course, people have to take out more debt, which results in higher fees again. In other words, it's the source of the problem is the thing that is driving the debt in the first place, and it's an unpleasant cycle. There might be another way of doing this, but I think the negative could easily argue that this is just going to feed the problem and makes it worse in the long run. But you have to be making that argument about how we need to filter through people. We need to make choices. We need that there's, the president says, everybody should get this. nobody wants to deny somebody who has the ability to do this the right to do that. I think everybody sees that that's true. But we also have to recognize there are just a lot of people that can't do it. They aren't able to do it. They don't need to do it. And there are other things that people ought to be doing. We're back to that issue about whether or not going to college is a good investment. For a lot of people, it is. For a lot of people, there are better investments to make. Yeah, well, get some kind of. I'm so thankful that I don't have to do some of those jobs that I see other people doing. I can't do those jobs. I think that's a hard job to do. I have all kinds of admiration for people who know how to. I got an electrical problem in my house I got to get fixed. I got to call an electrician and pay that guy a lot of money to do that. And he knows what he's doing. He didn't have to have a college education to do that. He had to go through some kind of training to do that. And I'm glad to pay him. That's what he's worth. I'm just thankful. I don't have to crawl into the attic. I don't have to dig in the holes. I don't have to plug, Thank God I'm not having to do that kind of stuff. We all make trade-offs and those sorts of things. So I'm an idiot when it comes to that sort of thing. And that guy has to do that hard work for a longer period of time, So it's just like we all make trade-offs. That's the nature of the world. I think you guys ought to be willing to say that a little bit more. That seems to me like the negative position is the system that we have now does a pretty good job of filtering these things. Are there ways to maybe address the debt issue? We could find other ways to address the debt issue without giving away free college education to everybody who wants it. And like I said, I think that's where you maybe want to argue that there are plenty of ways that we could alter the existing assistance programs. You mentioned the Obama forgiveness issue. Well, what is that? How does that work? How do we expand that? There might be ways to do that sort of thing. Isn't that one of those things where if you become a teacher or something,
No, basically the Obama Act, what it is, it's if you qualify based on how much debt you have as a college student, and if you still depending on how long you were in school, basically what you do is you set the 25-year loan plan that you have. They bring it down to 15 years, and they give you you don't have to pay monthly. It's every 3 months that you have to pay, and they downgrade the
interest.
The interest, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
they downgrade the interest to, I believe it's 0.1.
So calling it forgiveness is a misnomer.
No, because
You still are paying for it.
But they take
But
half
they
of
they
that.
all literally they pay so if you have a $10,000 debt, you pay $2,000 and then you get everything else gets written. So you don't have to pay the full $10,000.
Yeah, because you're reducing the interest so substantially. Yeah, well, that would be one of those things that you could say, we could address this issue in the present system. We've got a program in place to do this. Here's how it works. Why aren't people taking advantage of this when it's available for them to take advantage of? And that would address the problem that the affirmative is talking about. And there's your inherency argument.
Can I have 10 minutes on that thing?
What's that?
Can I
You-
have 10 minutes?
Oh, yeah. You want a 10-minute, you want an extra rebuttal? No, you don't get an extra rebuttal, sorry. Okay, so, I think you've got good issues here. It's not well organized. It needs to be better organized. I think that you folks have missed the disadvantage arguments that are necessary in the debate, and that you're not taking advantage of their missing the disadvantages as much, although you do focus on the debt issue pretty effectively. All right, thank you.